bit. All right, so we're just going to jump into it because we really do have quite a bit to cover. And every time I teach, everybody's like, oh no, there's a lot to cover again. And when Caleb says there's a lot to cover, that means there's a lot to cover. Because normally I think I don't have that much and I go like an hour and a half. That's what happens, though, when you start to study this stuff out. I promise, though, I'm going to try not to go that long. Oh, that's why it's streaming backwards, is because my mother is streaming from her iPad and overriding the church stream.
I'm not.
Yes, you are. For those of you who watch on my mom's Facebook page, stop it. We actually have a real stream on our Facebook for the church, and Mom likes to use her iPad. So, anyways, so we're here because of the resurrection. Okay, and the moderately small issue is that should be the statement every time we gather. Is that we're here because of the resurrection. It's not a one-time event. It's a once-in-time, for-all-time event. Okay, so what I want to do today, I'm going to read you a few quotes from N.T. Wright, who is New Testament scholar, was the Archbishop of Canterbury, I believe. He's in the Anglican Church, prolific early church historian and New Testament writer, so lots of you already know him. But he has a book called The Resurrection of the Son of God, and it's in his Christian Origins series, which is this massively dense collection of books about why Christianity basically came to be and how. And a lot of times people get Wright mistaken, and they try to make all these theological points with these books, and he's working as a historian with these books, okay? So anyways, that to say, what he's written is very well respected, very well received. There are some issues with it, and that's fine. So if you go out and get these books, don't expect to have something that's 100% right. You should know by now that that's not how it works. Anyways, so it will be 100% right in the sense that he wrote it, but it won't be 100% right in that it's all correct from every viewpoint. Okay, I hope everybody gets that. Okay, so this is Wright, the author, talking. He says, what, though, do we mean by historical? And we're talking about the historical idea of the resurrection. And actually, before I get into this, I should just preface and say, there's like 1,000 different directions you can go when you begin to talk about the crucifixion. And it is the reason why we have a book called the Bible. It is a reason why we have a religion called Christianity. Okay, but really the resurrection is the reason why, because lots of people were crucified. So, but the crucifixion is a part of it, and so all this is a part. Friday, Thursday night is when the cross happened, and none of us were in church last week, so we can still talk about it. And if you look in the Gospels, the crowd is gathered, and there's Barabbas, and we all know this story. They're going to release one of the prisoners, and they say, give us Barabbas. And I think a lot of times we don't read very closely there, and it says, actually, give us Jesus Barabbas. The guy has the same name, okay? And he's a violent revolutionary. And so, interpretively then, we're faced with the question every Easter, do we choose violent social revolution or do we choose the way of peace?
That's good.
And so that's an interpretive move we can make with the Easter story. Okay? And, we'll get into a little more about why I actually believe in the resurrection. Shocking. But a lot of scholars don't, and I just want to say, I don't care what you believe in that realm of things. My beliefs aren't formed by what you believe. So, anyways. So you could go that direction. We could focus on the whys of his arrest. We could focus on the betrayal. We could focus on the person of Judas. We could focus on the supper and who was in attendance at the Last Supper. There's a lot that you can go through. But we're here on Sunday, and it's Easter Sunday, so we're going to focus on the resurrection. And when we focus on the resurrection, there's a lot of different directions you can go. Right? If you're charismatic, you talk about the power of resurrection life, and then you start speaking in tongues. If you are a stuffy evangelical, you talk about how the resurrection is proof that you're right. If you're a Pentecostal, Lord forgive you. No. I'm kidding. Everyone's welcome and fine and included and wrong. We're all wrong. You can say that you're wrong if I say so am I. See, that works. We're all wrong. We've all got a lot wrong. None of us have it all right, and anybody that says they have it all right is wrong. So this is N.T. Wright. Again, discussing the historical reality of the resurrection. And some of you are going to go, yeah, so? And that's fine, but I like the history stuff, and I'm a nerd, and this stuff appeals to me. And so the historical reality of the resurrection is what makes me a Christian. Okay? Claims of people who claim to have done miraculous things in Africa don't make me a Christian. And books written by people who wandered off into the desert and levitated 6 inches above the ground while feasting on camel dung don't make me a Christian. Well, yeah, read the story of the early mystics. They were strange. Those things they're good. They're icing on the cake, I guess, if you want to call it that. But that's not why. Okay? So N.T. Wright, what though do we mean by historical? History and its cognates have been used within debates about Jesus and the resurrection in at least 5 significantly different ways. So he's going to list these 5 ways that people debate the historicity of Jesus and the historicity of his events and his activities and his ministry and his life, death, burial, and resurrection. Okay? And this is huge in the scholarly world. And again, most of the church says, what? Like, why is there even an argument here? Well, because scholars are sometimes obtuse. And they say, well, this can't happen because science says it can't happen. So, yeah, and we're going to hit that here in just a second. First, there is history as event. If we say something is historical in this sense, it happened, whether or not we can know or prove that it happened. The death of the last pterodactyl is in that sense a historical event, even though no human witnessed it or wrote about it at the time, and we are very unlikely ever to discover when and where it took place. Similarly, when we use the word historical of persons or things to indicate simply and solely that they existed. Second, there is history as significant event. Not all events are significant. History, as it is often assumed, consists of the ones that are. Okay, so there's a lot strung together between the things that we know of history that we will never know. Okay? So history is made of significant events. The adjective that tends to go with this is historic. A historic event is not simply an event that took place, but one whose occurrence carried momentous consequences. Likewise, a historic person, building, or object is the one perceived to have had particular significance, not merely existence. Third, there is history as provable event. To say that something is historical in this sense is to say that not only that it happened, but that we can demonstrate that it happened on the analogy of mathematics or the so-called hard sciences. This is somewhat more controversial. To say X may have happened, but we can't prove it, so it isn't really historical, may not be self-contradictory, but it is clearly operating with a more restricted sense of history than some others. Fourth, and quite different from the previous 3, there is history as writing about events in the past. Okay, that's like all those words are hyphenated to make it one big word. To say that something is historical in this sense is to say that it was written about, or perhaps could in principle have been written about. This might even include historical novels. A variant on this, though, an important one, is oral history. At a time when many regarded the spoken word as carrying more authority than the written, history as speaking about events in the past is not to be sneezed at. Fifth, and finally, a combination of 3 and 4, is often found precisely in discussions of Jesus. History as what modern historians can say about a topic. By modern, I mean post-Enlightenment, the period in which people have imagined some kind of analogy, even correlation between history and the hard sciences. In this sense, historical means not only that which can be demonstrated and written, but that which can be demonstrated and written within the post-Enlightenment worldview. This is a long quote, sorry. This is what people have often had in mind when they have rejected the historical Jesus, which hereby, of course, comes to mean the Jesus that fits the Procrustean bed of a reductionist worldview. That's Wright's little kind of slap in the face, in favor of the Christ of faith. And so this whole discussion is in the introductory sections of this book. And what he's doing is he's outlining the idea of the resurrection as a historical event. But when you get to discussing that stuff, you got to define what you mean by historical. And we've seen some of this as we've gone through Genesis 1 through 11, right? We know that the historical event that is at the epicenter of Genesis 1 to 11 is the flood. 1 to 11 is not the creation narratives. Those are part of the flood story. Okay? In order to get to a flooded earth, you have to have an earth. And so it needs to be created. And you can pick any epic novel series you like. You know, the Hobbit series or the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe series. There's a book in there that most of us don't read that's like the setup of the universes, and it's part of the story. You know, the story of the Lord of the Rings is that Frodo destroys the ring. You know, but the journey there is 7-8 books. And all the other stuff is introductory material, and ever present is the story of the ring's destruction. Okay? So ever present in Genesis 1 to 11 is the story of the flood. This is what's on our mind as we're reading, right? Well, this isn't unique to Genesis 1 to 11. Ever present in the Gospels is the event of the resurrection. Okay? And so when we're reading the Gospels, we are not reading biographies. We need to get this straight. Because if we are reading historical biographies, one of them is right and the other three are wrong. And this is actually best demonstrated with the resurrection accounts in the various Gospels. I don't want to take the time to read through every single one of them today, because that would take us a very long time, because there's a lot there. But what I will say you can do, if you want to write these down, I'll give you the verses, and you can go read these on your own time. And we're going to point out some things today that are said in here in these varying accounts. So the first one is Mark 16, and it's basically the whole chapter. There's two things there. We'll get to that in just a minute. The second is Matthew 28. The third is Luke 24. And the fourth is John 20. So if you're so inclined and you would like to see how Caleb studies, go home and read Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, in that order. Because Mark was written first. And start noting the differences and the similarities in the accounts. And we're going to go over some of those today. But it'll help you with what I am trying to get at when I talk about the event that shapes the story. Okay? So let me scroll back up and I'll get back into my notes because I gave you those ahead. So we're talking then the resurrection as a historical event, but what do we mean by historical event? Do we mean by scientifically provable? Can we go back and can we measure the cloth, the Shroud of Turin? Can we measure, something in that to determine whether Jesus actually really physically raised from the dead or not? No, we can't. Can we invent a telescope so powerful we can see him? No, we can't. Saw a black hole, though. That's pretty cool. But no. So scientifically, from the standpoint of hard science, no. We can't prove the resurrection as a historical event in that way by collecting evidence that attests to it, unless we do something that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So then historically, we have to talk about its significance as a significant event in human history. Okay, so we're not going to do the provability apologetics debate because I think that's futile. If John Dominic Crossan is a scholar that says resurrection of the body doesn't happen, therefore Jesus didn't resurrect, and I say, well, that's fine, then you're not a Christian scholar. Right. That's not saying I'm better than you. That's just saying one of the core beliefs of Christianity is the resurrection. That's like saying, well, I'm a Muslim, I just don't believe Muhammad was a prophet. No, you can't say that. You don't get to say that. That's part of the system of beliefs. And part of the system of beliefs is that he rose again on the third day. That's in all the creeds. That's in the verses. It's in every part of Christianity. So then we're going to talk this significant event. And the significant event is testified in the existence of something. Does anybody want to take a stab at what that is? The church. The church is the witness of the resurrection. And, it's in a day and age when we love to bash the building, and it's like people, and I did this because, you get zealous on either side when you don't have a lot of knowledge, and you leave the fundamentalist inerrant idea of Scripture, and then you attack it from the same standpoint, and you're still acting like that. It's just you changed your mind, and you're not learning to read it correctly, okay? And that's kind of, I don't remember where I was going with that, but that's kind of how I'm approaching this. Yeah, the church is not the building, right? And I get it, let's swing a wrecking ball at the four walls. That's nice until it starts raining or snowing, or until this many people show up at a house gathering and the city officials are like, well, you can't have this many people in your home. It's against fire code. So, there are reasons why we use buildings, and the building isn't holy, it's not sacred. You can drink beer in here if you want to. Thank God I do. I'm not right now because it's Easter and it's not noon yet. Yeah. Now I'm off topic. No, so the church is, its very existence, let's put it that way, is the evidence of the resurrection. And I want to read here, here's another quote from Wright. He says, he's talking about the first early church. He says, it was not like a club, not even like a religion. No sacrifices, no images, no oracles. Do we hear that? Charismatics? No garlanded priests. Do we hear that, everyone else? Certainly not like a racially based cult. Do we hear that, evangelicals? So what he's saying here then is the arrival of the church on the scene doesn't just happen. Okay? To understand this, you'd have to do a lot of studying and study religion in the ancient world and how it worked. Religion today is wildly different than religion in the ancient world. Atheism is, I want to say totally, but I'll just say almost to cover my butt, almost totally unknown in the ancient world. It is, no, sorry, you don't get to disbelieve in the gods, you can just believe in different ones. For a Roman or a Greek, it is totally fine that a Jew worships Yahweh. He's one of the gods. That's fine. Pick one, don't care. The Jewish stance of God alone is very unique. Other cultures were fine with you worshiping other gods. You just needed to worship something, And most of the time, also the state god, And we still have that. It's just named differently now. It's not called Molech. It's. Mm-hmm. So anyways, yeah, this is not based in any sort, and this is important because there's a lot of stupidity floating around about, the early church was socialist or the early church was capital. No, the early church were Christians.
Yes. Thank you.
And that's different. Okay? To say I am a Christian was a political stance. Okay? You couldn't be something else in front of Christian. Well, I'm a conservative Christian. I'm a liberal Christian. Shut up. Just drop the second term off and say what you want to say. And that's fine. Have your stuff. But this would have been baffling to the early church. Okay? Not that they didn't have disagreements, they did. Even in the New Testament time, they weren't all in one accord. They argued in front of Jesus. What makes you think they got along after he left? Which one of us is more important? He's like, really? This is where we are? Are you for? Who do you love more? Well, obviously I gave him more Cheerios. That's my answer to my kids now. Why did he get that? Because I love him more. And they all like, no, you don't. Like, ha. Okay, so then this is where we are, okay? We're living in the reality of the church's existence, and the church's existence is because of the reality of the resurrection. Okay? In the ancient world, religions did not just spring up from the ground for no reason. Right. Okay? Religions were founded in ancient times, from the foundations of the world. Okay? And what we have to understand is every religion at this time had a creation narrative. Okay, so that's how far back their religion went, to the very creation of the world. So for a new religion to have sprung up around the story of a dead man raising again is irrational. It's also illogical. It's also why we see all this stuff about the new creation. Because they know that in order to do this, they have to have an origin story. And so Jesus becomes the origin story. In the beginning was the Word. Okay? Okay, so then just like Genesis 1 to 11, and we're almost out of my intro paragraph. I feel good about that. Just like Genesis 1 to 11 is centered around the flood, we can say that each of the Gospels are centered around something, and that something is the resurrection. And we can say, oh, no, it's the life of Jesus. And scholars want to say, well, Matthew is trying to re-Judaize Jesus. He is, but the central focal point is the resurrection. Okay? And we don't got time to do this, but there are things you can do grammatically, even in English, to go read some of the verses that are in there and understand what you're reading comes from a post-resurrection viewpoint. They wrote after the resurrection. Okay? Jesus did not have a Morgan Freeman walking along with him dictating his life. And he stopped at the shore of Galilee. This happened 40 years, at the earliest, 40 years after the ascension. So there's a community, get this, that's already been in existence before the first gospel was ever written. And we would know that if we would date the letters and understand, like Paul's writing to a church that exists before there's a text. How does the church exist before there's a Bible? Well, they gathered around something. What do you think they gathered around? The Ten Commandments. Nope. No, they gathered around the resurrection. Every Sunday, they gathered around the resurrection. Every Sunday. From house to house, all week long, they met each other's needs. They fed people. They healed people. They prayed for people. They just played games. They ate together. And then on Sundays, they got together and they celebrated the resurrection. Every Sunday. Not once a year when the government says, oh, okay, we'll close all our banks for Friday. Every Sunday. Can you imagine that? Oh, we have to live every Sunday like this? No, you don't have to. Yeah, when you understand what it is and what it's about, and we'll get there, like, woo, you want to. So then, for Mark, because he's the first one, right? That event is the death of Jesus and culmination. And when I say the death of Jesus, that necessarily includes the resurrection. Okay, no early Christian would have said something like, well, I don't know if he rose from the dead or not. So then, in other words, each piece of the story of Mark gives us another inch toward our goal of the reality of the resurrection. And that can be said of every gospel. Okay? So I will read Mark's breakdown here because it's a shorter one. And then from there, I'll just note some differences in the other guys and what they say. So everything in the New Testament is a direct result of the resurrection. Everything. Paul writes what he writes because he encounters the resurrected Christ. Okay? Oh, well, why did Paul write this letter? Well, because there was a sexual sin going on in Corinth. No, go further back. He wrote this letter because Jesus is alive. So the Gospels then, as I've said, these are not meant to be biographies. They're meant to be sketches. Like we have two creation narratives that don't totally agree, but are moving toward the same point of the flood happening. Right? We have varying ideas of Jesus in the Gospels. The personality overlaps in all four. The events don't necessarily line up on a timeline with each other. Okay, that's what I'm getting at. And then these epistles, Paul writes to churches that are in existence before there is a Bible. And that, let that sink in. Just, there was a church before there was a Bible. Just let it sink. It's good. It's good for us to feel that. Papias was a first century commentator, and he said, I do not trust the writings. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm getting it pretty close. He says, because the writings are many and they're abundant and they're profuse, or something like that. And he says, but I trust the living and abiding word. And what he meant by that was the experience and the testimony of those who knew Jesus. Okay, and when you trust the testimony of those who knew Jesus, and Papias would have included some of these gospels in that word, testimony of those who knew Jesus. So, but the idea is that texts were written about people that made things more than they were. And Papias says this, and the interesting thing is the earliest church commentators don't ever correct him. They don't ever say, hey, and they say he's wrong on other things, but they don't ever say, hey, he was wrong here. That's just one of those things they leave alone. Okay? And then the pseudonymous letters, I'm going to say it that way, that are written to the various churches. And again, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, doesn't always mean that Paul wrote it. In fact, about half the time that just means hey, a student of Paul's an apostle of Jesus Christ. And it can be taken that way. In the name of Mike, if I'm writing something for Father's House Ministries and it's a general reply to something, I don't always sign my name. I just reply, and I'm speaking on their behalf when I do that. And people are going to think, oh, that came from Mike, and that's not a big deal. It shouldn't be soul crushing to find out that Paul didn't write some of the stuff we think he wrote. It's actually crushing to some of the crappy doctrine that's out there, though. So like the event of the flood, then the resurrection event has woven around it stories, and various ways of filling the gap with quick summaries of the activity of Jesus the person, the human guy, in relationship to his identity as resurrected Lord. Okay, and this is where we get the early church's discussion on his natures. And so his identity as resurrected Lord is always in view when these letters are written. Always. And I think sometimes what we tend to do, and what I call romanticizing the Bible, we go back and we're reading it, and we do like we do with a fiction, right? We sit there and we try and imagine the scene, and we put ourselves in the scene, and that's not how it works. But the idea is every time the reason they talk about Jesus at all is because they consider him to be Lord of all. And the reason they consider him Lord of all is because of the resurrection. Okay. Now we're finally to a Bible verse. So let's read Mark 16. And I'm going to get my app open here because I want to just blaze through it without having to look at the screen too much. No. And again, I'm reading from a Bible that most of you don't have, so some of the words might look a little different, but... Okay, so we're going to read all the way through verse 20. It isn't long. Some of these verses are very short, but this is the first resurrection account, the earliest that was written. Let's put it that way. Okay? Unless you want to get into the debate on Paul's, because he wrote earlier, and Paul talks about seeing the resurrected Christ. And so there's a resurrection account that happens earlier than the gospel accounts, but the gospel accounts are supposed to be earlier. Remember this leapfrogging thing? And it keeps going back and forth. So we have a man who experienced the resurrected Christ, and we have either community or the disciples themselves who are writing about the human Christ and his resurrection. And when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome purchased fragrant spices so that they could go and anoint him. And very early in the morning on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb after the sun had risen. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. And as they were going into the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb because trembling and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Okay, now we have the shorter ending of Mark. So they promptly reported all the things they had been commanded to those around Peter, and after these things, Jesus himself also sent out through them from the east, even as far as the west, the holy and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Amen. Okay? In the world of biblical studies, typically speaking, the shorter manuscript wins the day when they're talking about the earliest and most original, because people like to do commentary. Okay? So generally, when we have an expansion, it means it happened later. That kind of makes sense. Usually they don't, like especially in biblical stuff, they don't contract things down. They exegete, right? They're trying to get out of it more. So this is the longer ending. Now early on the first day of the week, after he rose, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had expelled 7 demons. She went out and announced it to those who were with him while they were mourning and weeping. And those, when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, refused to believe it. And after these things, he appeared in a different form to 2 of them as they were walking, while they were going out into the countryside. And these went and reported it to the others, and they did not believe them. And later, while they were reclining at table, he appeared to the 11, and he reprimanded their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had been raised. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation," not all men, all creation. "The one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who refuses to believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will expel demons, they will speak in new tongues, they will pick up snakes, and sometimes they will get bit. And if they drink any deadly poison, it will never hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will get well." Then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and proclaimed everywhere, while the Lord was working together with them and confirming the message through the accompanying signs. So, like I said, the expansion here is almost certainly a later church doing, based in some things that probably happened. Okay? But what we want to note here first is that it's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jacob, and they say James. I don't know why they do this, but the name is Jacob, and we know that name. That's Jacob. That's not a big deal. And if Mary is the mother of Jacob James, then she's also the mother of Jesus. And then Salome, who doesn't really outline who that is, right? But Matthew's account is going to tell us that this is the mother of James and John. And then the scholarly Greek lexicon also notes that too. So I'm going to go ahead and trust that and say that's James and John's mom. And the reason why Mark probably just kind of threw her name in there is because everybody knew that. Didn't need to qualify her. She was well known, to that group. Note then that this is on the first day. There's a very early arrival, and then the stone is rolled away. Okay? And inside there is a young man in white on the right. And then again, the commission to preach is given to women. So then, we've been doing this before, right? We've been looking at what ancient interpreters did with the scripture that was in front of them. And we've seen how one of the Targum writers inserted a huge story that wasn't in the text to explain the words, "the one who escaped" in Genesis. Who is that? Who's that one? So they try to explain that, right? Well, Mark, this later manuscript is doing some interpretive work, okay? And it's trying to say, okay, this is all resulting from what happened, okay? And again, there's some things, we're not going to go into all of it, but there are some things in there that are kind of like clues into the fact that this is the church later on that's already been in existence for a little while, talking. Okay? And again, this is like us, we know we have a Grand Canyon. How did it form? Well, the scientists are going to say erosion, and the folklorists are going to say, well, Paul Bunyan did it, and so it just kind of depends on who you talk to. And in all of those instances, the Grand Canyon is a static reality. Okay, so if I ask John the folklorist about the resurrection, I'm going to get a different spin than I will if I ask Mark the excited child. And I'm saying that because of their literary styles. Mark is like, and. You ever heard a story from a kid? And this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this. That's Mark if you read it in Greek. And you can't get the story out fast enough. Okay, that's excitement about the point that he's getting to. Okay, I have an end that I'm going toward. And boom, it's resurrection. Okay. So then we have this longer reading. It's the first day, very early. Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. Then she preaches, and then they don't believe. And then Jesus appears to two of them, and it's hard to tell what's going on there, but the Greek word is a masculine pronoun, so it appears to two men. Jesus isn't it. Which is important because it's not the other two women that were listed before. It's men. Okay, so it's the earliest account says he appeared to women, and the editorial account says, well, no, wait, hey, there were some men there too. That's important. Verse 8 says that Mary preached the imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation, while verses 15 and 16 say Jesus commissioned the disciples to preach salvation by belief in baptism. So which one is it? Some lights just went on, huh? You're like, wait, I've never looked at it that way. Well, this is what happens, okay? And it's not a big deal. It's not that we need to toss one or the other. We just need to recognize when someone's doing an interpretive move on things. So 9 to 20 have too many places where later church influence then seems obvious. Verse 17, Nathan, can you put 9:17 up there? These signs will follow those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues. What do you think that brings to mind? Pentecost. So then, in other words, most likely, and we know this because of the time of the writing of Mark, Pentecost has already happened. Okay. Verse 18. Let's read this one. They will take up serpents. Who does that? Who? In what book? Acts. That's when the church is being founded. And then verse 19. So then after the Lord had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. How does the author know? Can he see the right hand of God? I thought no one could look on God. There's a myriad of questions that need to be answered. No, this is it's got a flair of the mythic on purpose. Okay, it's a later editor saying, hey, some of the theological stuff that these guys have worked out is probably right. Let's get this into the book of Mark too, into the letter, whatever. Okay. Then for the sake of time, because all of you are like, good Lord, it's almost noon and he's still talking, I'm going to just note the differences in the rest. So we should be out of here by 1:30 and just in time that the Mormons will be done at their restaurants. I don't know, on Easter they may go longer than us. Matthew 28, 1-10, it's Mary and the other Mary who appear at the tomb. Okay, Salome isn't there. There's an earthquake, and then an angel descends and rolls away the stone and sits on it. He's not inside. He's not to the right. He's not dressed in white, or at least that's not noted. Then he has a discussion with the guards who are not in Mark. And then the women are shown the inside of the grave. Wait a second, I thought they went in there and found the guy there. Let's go ahead and put up 28:15 of Matthew, because I want to just note something here. Okay, so not too much different here. Most scholars will say Matthew borrowed from Mark, which isn't uncommon. Lots of authors used sources in those days. And so Mark probably knew the oral tradition that was circulating in the church and got it written down as quickly as he could, and. And then the other disciples' communities or other authors took those stories and they said, well, I experienced it this way, or our community talks about it this way. And our community stems from John, who fell on Jesus' breast and heard the heartbeat of God. So there are different ways that they frame this through the personal experience of the ones who were with him. Okay, so verse 15 says, it's Matthew 28:15, sorry. So they took the money and did as they were instructed, and this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. Those three words are always important in the Bible because they give us some insight into when it's being written later. Okay, this is the story about how the guards go back and the leaders say, oh, tell them someone stole the body. Don't, because the guards saw the resurrection. And so, this is a common accusation in the first century of the church. Okay, is that someone just stole Jesus' body, you guys are all idiots. And so this story gets wrapped into Matthew's story to give an explanation for why this accusation is around. Is this historic? I don't know. It's there and it was an accusation. Did it actually happen? I don't know, but Matthew's author felt like it was important enough to include. And then there's a Great Commission in Matthew, and it kind of mirrors Mark 16:9 on, so we're not going to worry too much about that. Then in Luke 24, this is the longest one. That's why I'm saving you the torment of reading through the entire thing from up front. You all know how to read. Read it yourselves. It's a great story. In Luke, the women find the stone already rolled away. Okay, so there's no earthquake. There's no guy sitting on the rock. It's already rolled away. And then inside the tomb, there are two men, not just one, with gleaming appearance. So they're not dressed in white. They're just shiny. Maybe they were working out before that. Sorry, just doing CrossFit. Yeah, he's not here. And then, you got any Red Bull? And then Joanna gets added to the list. Okay? Joanna's important for Luke. And then something happens the ring did not intend. That doesn't happen in the other two. Peter gets up to go investigate. I wonder why Peter gets up to go and investigate as opposed to any of the other disciples. Anybody want to take a stab at that one? Well, there's that, but something else happens in Acts with Peter. He becomes the head of the church. And Acts is written by Luke. So Luke Acts is part 1, part 2. Okay, you should always read those two together. Because right at the beginning of Acts, Luke says, in my former account, O Theophilus, I wrote to you about the work and person of Jesus Christ. Okay, and so what he's done is he's put something into the resurrection story that gives Peter kind of a see, he should be the head of the church. Is he wrong? I'm not saying that. It's just different. And he has reasons for doing that because Peter becomes very important in Acts. So he needs to be important in the resurrection too because Acts only happens because of the resurrection. Okay. Then there's the road to Emmaus, which is unique to Luke, but you see kind of hints of that in Mark, right? It says they went off. And in Matthew it says the same thing. They went off and they were walking, doing their thing, basically. And Jesus explains all the scriptures. It's a long walk. Unless he was like, I don't know. In verse 30, Jesus is recognized by the group. Let's go ahead and put that up there. Luke 24:30. Now it came to pass as he sat at the table with them that he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Now, there's been a lot of story before this point, and they don't know who he is. But then he sits down at a table, and they go, oh. Why? Well, I would say because he's only recognized at the table. You don't recognize him in the journey. You recognize him at the table. The reason that the Pharisees hated Jesus so much, the reason, is that the doctrine that the table was a form of altar had already kind of been moving into Judaism, and it became the kind of official doctrine after the destruction of the temple. Okay, and so Jesus has sinners eat at his altar. And he just eats with them. He doesn't make them clean. They don't have to do the ritual purifications. They don't have to sacrifice. He just eats. And if he's divinity and he's eating the table bread and there's no veil, like this is the Holy of Holies. The table is the Holy of Holies. And Jesus is only recognized in the Holy of Holies when he's doing his priestly job of breaking the bread. Verse 39, Jesus has flesh and blood. I think this is important. Marcus Borg said that resurrection in this milieu, I like to use that word, isn't resuscitation. And it's not reanimation. It's recreation. Okay, so it's like, but new. So he sits and he has flesh and blood and he says he's hungry. So he eats. And then he explains the scriptures again because they didn't get it the first time because they're people. Just a question I want to ask in 24:46, which is after all this. Could you pull that one up real quick, Nathan? This is homework for next week. If somebody finds this, just let me know. Sorry, Luke 24:46. Then he said to them, "Thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and rise from the dead the third day." Please go find me that reference. Where is it written? No, it's not. Thus it is written. Okay, so when they say it is written, they're usually referring to the scripture. But you're not going to find anywhere in our Old Testament where it says that it's necessary for the Messiah to suffer and rise from the dead on the third day.
Okay, but didn't he talk about the destruction of the
Jesus does. But that says it is written.
And doesn't it say in Isaiah that the Messiah would
Rise on the third day? No.
would suffer?
Okay, well, suffering servant in Isaiah, this is actually a good question to talk about. It's off topic, but Isaiah's suffering servant, right? And everybody applies this to Jesus, and there are notes of messianic ideas in Isaiah, yes. But a prophet in ancient Israel speaking 600 years before the birth of Christ is not talking about 600 years in the future. He's talking about his own context. So when he says the Messiah will come, a Messiah just means anointed one, and they anointed their kings, and a virgin will conceive is not a virgin, it is a young woman in Hebrew. Okay, there's no, that word isn't the same word. Virgin is a bad translation. It says the young woman, and Hezekiah's wife was a young woman, and Hezekiah had a son. Okay, so this prophet is most likely prophesying about something that's going to happen in their immediate context. Take heart, Israel, 600 years from now, God will redeem you. Does not bring hope to the people that are facing what they're facing. Okay, so we got to be careful then when we take Hebrew Bible passages and say, this is about Jesus. It's not. It never was. The disciples and the apostles later take their stories, and why I'm doing what I'm doing is I'm trying to help everybody get to a point where we are reading the text for what it actually says. Because when we get doctrinal with the text, we start trying to explain why it says what it says. And if we just let it say what it says, we'll get the story. Okay, and so then the idea with Isaiah then is they're already in trouble. There's already stuff going on from which they need deliverance. Okay, and so Paul's use and the other guys, Matthew, who use things from Isaiah, they're doing what the Old Testament authors did, right? They're grabbing the literature that they know and they're plugging Jesus into the God spot. They're saying he's divine, so this must be him. Does that mean that they're right 100% of the time? I want to be careful by just saying no, no, but also maybe we just need to look at it a little more openly and say, okay, they're not making doctrine here as much as they're just relating it to something that they already know. Okay, so but that's an awesome question because Isaiah is a big one, and all over America right now, churches are preaching that God beat the shit out of Jesus so that he could be happy with you. You know, and that's garbage. And I'm like really happy that we don't have to teach that nonsense here. Because I'd be thrown out. The pastor would be like, whoa, you just swore and you're saying penal substitution is garbage. You know, so that is a viable thing that we got. But is it written, though, that he has to raise on the third day? No, I mean, maybe in some of the Second Temple texts. Well, we have some of them. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure that some of my scholar friends can give me some Second Temple stuff and resurrection is a debate. Why do you think Pharisees and Sadducees are against each other? The Pharisees believe in the resurrection and the Sadducees don't, and all the cheesy American pastors say, that's why they're sad, you see? It's like a bad dad joke from the pulpit every time they talk about the two groups. But the idea is the debate is already there. And the Pharisees believed in the resurrection. Those evil legalistic Pharisees. They believed in a resurrection from the dead. So let's square up what we're thinking here. Man, we could do a big thing on the Pharisees too. That would be fun. Not the sad ones, because they're not around anymore. Because they didn't resurrect. Ba-doom-ts. Okay, where is it written? We don't know. And then in verses 50 to 53 again, the ascension. Then John 21 to 29, here's where we're going to wrap up. Mary comes alone, and she finds the stone already rolled away. She leaves and tells Peter and John, who is the other disciple. John, forever in history, made himself appear better than Peter because he says, well, no, he says they both ran to the empty tomb, and then some versions say, but John ran on ahead, meaning like John was just a little bit faster. Written by John, read for thousands of years by millions of people. Everybody knows he's faster than Peter. Yeah, he's in better shape. It's because he fought so much. Peter's too busy denying him, and John's out in a drunken brawl with his brother. Let's go to John 20 and verse 9. He's getting there. That's 7. There you go. Then as soon as they had come to the land, they saw a fire of coals there and fish laid on it and bread. So, in essence, remember John's a fisherman. So John's going to frame the event of the resurrection through the lens of a fisherman. Yeah. And where is Jesus' table with him? It's on the beach at a fire. Yeah. Like for me, it would be up in the mountains by the river. And there'd be a campfire. Jesus would have a nice Jewish IPA. Is this bottomless? And he'd go, oh yeah. Okay, then everyone leaves. And then we have this vision of two men in the tomb. And their placement, it says one is at the head and one is at the foot. And anybody want to take a stab at where we see that in the Hebrew Bible? Yeah, over the atonement seat. There's an angel, there's cherubim saying this is the place of reconciliation, right here. Okay, so John is saying this is the place of resurrection is the place of reconciliation. Okay, it's not belief. You're not reconciled because you believe. You have been reconciled, says Paul, so be reconciled. Okay, and so for John, theologically, and this is profound, I think, he places these, he's like, hey, there are two angels in some of these stories. Maybe the two Marys when they're telling, because these stories really overlap quite a bit. And so maybe the two Marys, when they're telling these stories to the disciples, like one Mary's like, how when sometimes you see people in profile, like someone can be behind them, but you don't see them? So maybe this is what happens, right? Maybe Mary goes in and she sees one angel, she's like, there was an angel. And the other Mary says, no, 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 I came in this way and there were two. And John's like, yeah, and one's at the head and one's at the foot, and they're facing each other, and they're covering the atonement seat where reconciliation takes place. So then this interesting thing happens in verse 17 here. And yeah, I'll want that. Jesus says this kind of unique command, and it might seem funky compared to what happens next. He said to them the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. No, that's not the right verse. Doggone it. There's one where 20. Sorry, Nathan, that's 21. Chapter 20, verse 17. No, you're fine. It's only the resurrection.
No pressure.
No pressure.
I could have had it ready too, sorry. There you are. Jesus said to her, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. Now, the words do not cling to me, probably better would be do not touch me. For I have not yet ascended to my Father. Anyone familiar enough with John that they know what happens next? We have the story of Thomas, who gets to touch him. So wait, why did Jesus tell her not to touch him? But Thomas gets to touch him.
She's a woman. That's good.
I don't have an answer there. I just want to know. Why Jesus says, my gut feeling is that the story of Thomas is a separate story that got kind of like popped in.
Yep.
Not that the story of Thomas is untrue.
So do you think he ascended already?
No, I think the Thomas story has, in the scholarly world they call it a historical kernel. That's the way of saying like something happened and we don't know what. So I think the Thomas story has a historical kernel, and I think it's part of it. And they just kind of like, boom, it's in this gospel. John knows Thomas, so there it is. I'm sure that there's a better answer than that. Okay, but what happens after all of that is that Jesus once again sits down and he breaks bread and fish on the shore. And so his primary objective when he raises from the dead after 3 days is to eat a nice piece of fish. He's a good Jewish man. No, he is to eat, but is to get back to the altar. He's like, okay, the sacrificial work has been done, and yeah, I know, we'll get into that. The table can be accessed. Now, come on. So then we live within the effect of the resurrection. And the church is the evidence of the resurrection. Okay? Nothing, and this is what's always kind of baffled me about the way that we approach talking to people about Jesus. We approach them as though the resurrection is not a historical reality already in their lives.
That's good. That's really good.
You don't make Jesus resurrect from the dead when you believe.
That's right.
It's a historical reality evidenced by the existence and life and activity of the church. And we could read all kinds of stories of early church martyrdom, and the most impressive to me is Polycarp. Okay? Polycarp was John's disciple. And when Polycarp was martyred, the Roman guards came to get him, and his connection with the risen Jesus was such, and his resolve that Jesus had truly resurrected from the dead was such, that when the guards came to get him to arrest him and take him to his death, and he knew this, he anointed their feet, prayed for them, and made them dinner for the journey so they wouldn't get tired. And when they threw him in the flames, they said, "Renounce your Lord." And he said, "No more could I renounce my own existence." And then the story goes that he smelled like baking bread when he was burning. and that pure gold came out and a dove ascended. And so there's some, there's some fun stuff that happens there, but people don't do that for a story that they got some doubts about. I have a sneaking suspicion this isn't true, but let's go ahead and just throw me in the fire just in case. Mothers don't watch their children be put to death. Any good mother that has any inkling of a doubt is going to renounce in a second when their child's life is on the line. But when you know that the witness is that there is life beyond the life after death, that's N.T. Wright makes the point that resurrection is not life after death. It's life after death. Okay? When you know that is the reality, you can walk into these things, okay? The early church had no fear. Athanasius talks about how the mark of Christianity in the early church is their complete and utter disregard for death. They treat it as a thing to be despised because they know it's been trampled down, he says. And we're back to being terrified of it today. We got all kinds of medicines. You can live to be 100 really easily. You can pop a pill and you can go. And most, if not all, of what we do is driven once again by a fear of death. Yep, sure is. Or what we do or don't do. Right? And this is what Paul says, the primary thing he's come to do is deliver us from the fear of death. Why? Because he was answered. Death was answered. So then if we live within the effect of the resurrection and the church is the evidence of the resurrection and the message we proclaim is resurrection life and it's a gift of grace, we need to throw that in there because people are like, oh, well, it's still, you have to do this and that. And they know it's a gift of grace. And the second you have any economy in it, it is no longer grace. Does that make sense? Yeah. If I have to pay $250,000 or $10,000, it's still an economy. Yeah. Oh, but it's cheap. All you have to do is believe. Neat. Take my quarter. And dispense the right thing for me, vending machine God. Finally, and this is closing, I just want to read you this because I love this quote, and this is from the Orthodox Wiki, and I tried to find a quote of who the person was that wrote it, but I can't, so I'll just quote that, and it's orthodoxwiki.org. And this is from the Eastern Orthodox understanding, and it's very widely accepted in that church. The resurrection of Christ is simultaneously also the resurrection of humanity. The resurrection is not only the resurrection of Christ, but a majestic, universal, cosmic event. Universal and cosmic, and everything that was bound up in his death gets bound up in his resurrection and in his life after death. And let's go ahead and expand that phrase really quick because I still have a few more minutes because I set the time when we get out. The life after death is the church. Does that make sense? The church is the evidence and the witness of the resurrection. And that's not enough. I don't care. It's enough for people who want to follow Christianity. So let's go celebrate that. Amen? You're dismissed as it's raining.